Okay, it is the top of the hour, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fifth installment of United by Sustainability, a series presented by the SCA. And today we are addressing the topic of coffee and forests. With this world of presenting many webinars, we thought we'd have a little fun with our photographs here. I'm Ellie Hudson, and my co-host is Kim Elena Ionescu. I'm the host of this series from the SCA staff. I'm the Sustainability Partnerships Director after working as the PCR, that's the Price Crisis Response Project Director. My co-host, Kim Elena Ionescu, is SCA's Chief Sustainability and Knowledge Development Officer. This morning, it's morning for me, you'll be hearing mostly from me in this session. Kim is here to support us and support our speakers, and then also to participate in the Q&A. And we are joined today, another frat back. This, I'm told, is a photo from Indonesia. Our special guest today is Bambi Semroc. She is the Vice President of Sustainable Markets and Strategy at Conservation International. I'm going to go through a little bit of introduction and then hand it over to Bambi. But before I do that, I just want to also acknowledge the many additional staff who are contributing to this session or have contributed behind the scenes. So thank you, Julie Hausch, Sierra Hatcher, Pernilla Gard, Kim Elena Ionescu, Danny Pinnell, and thank you to my colleagues at Conservation International, Niels Haak and Valerie Beard, who along with Bambi made this educational session happen, including a huge amount of downloadable content. So those of you that are attending this webinar live have the benefit of being able to download directly from this webinar several resources, and then we've also provided some links to additional resources that will come up in the discussion. If you're watching this as a recording, you can just email us at webinars@sca.coffee or sustainability@sca.coffee, and we can provide that to you anytime. So this series, I think, if you haven't attended a session yet, just wanted to emphasize that this is something we created as the SCA Sustainability and Knowledge Development Department as a place to come together and an opportunity for learning. It's open to anyone interested in sustainability, in specialty coffee, whether you're an expert or just becoming interested. So on behalf of the SCA, welcome. We do produce this twice a week for now. Our final session of season 1 will be on Tuesday. So today we will be doing this session again a little bit later at noon Pacific time. We start each session with a brief update on the COVID-19 situation. We don't want to forget to address that, acknowledging the role that this situation is playing for many of our businesses and many people in our community. So it's a good time for me to direct your attention to your GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar control panel dashboard. Should be a session that says handouts 5 of 5. And if you open that up, you can see that there are a couple logos here for PDFs. Probably the very last one is United by Sustainability Resources 5. So if you open this up, there are some of the links that I mentioned, but also importantly, there's a link to SCA's community contributed COVID-19 updates page. There is a lot here, and we hope that you'll take a look if you are in need of support or just looking for local resources or ways to connect with other people in the community. Most of these resources are in English, but we welcome submissions and resources in any language. So this is a little bit of framing of what we really mean when we say we're going to talk about coffee and forests. I think for many in the SC community, the connection may or may not be obvious. And so we're going to learn a little bit about the connection between those two things today once I hand it over to Bambi. So there are a couple ways to participate. You can submit questions and comments through the chat or you raise your hand. We decided that we'll do all of the Q&A toward the end. If you have just a question that, something that's like tech support or something like that, you can submit that, but do submit your questions anytime. Just in terms of how that works, we will read your question out loud. If it's long, I will read it twice. And then we'll identify you by first name and give you the option to speak if you want. And if you don't want your name used, just mention that when you submit a question or comment, and we won't use it. We are going to be doing some polls like we always do in United by Sustainability sessions. These are confidential, so it just comes in as a response, and then what's shown is a percentage of the other attendees. So it's kind of neat that you get to make your voice heard, but also you can kind of see who else is here and what they, how they may be participating in, and what the other attendees' background might be. I've heard we have have had some feedback recently that sometimes we haven't made it clear that we do want this to be interactive. There is a lot of like presenters talking at attendees, but it's always better if we do hear from attendees and can interact if you have questions. So please do participate. Oh, I'm sorry, this is an outdated slide in the middle, so just ignore this 1 through 5. But the part that is important, all are welcome and encouraged to participate. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and launch our first poll. So first, we wanted to just find out a little bit about the people who are here. So first of all, what kind of activity are you involved in? Leave this open for about a minute, and again, the responses are confidential. If you're not involved in any of these things, just don't vote. I'm limited to 5 choices, so I couldn't do, without combining another one, which I really didn't want to do. I couldn't do a none of the above. All right, we've got about 70% of the votes in here. Leave it open for another 5 seconds or so. All right, so who's here? Very interesting. Definitely a mix. And then here's a question, a great transition about the link between coffee and deforestation. All right, we've got 77% in already. So I'm gonna just give it probably another 10 seconds. And I just got a note that one of the links in the last document, the registration link for the next webinar, is not clickable. So I'll go ahead and while Bambi's presenting, I'll go find that and put it in the announcements window so that you all have that. It's also possible that you can't click it because it's the same link as the webinar that you're in right now. I don't know. All right. So what do you think, Bambi?
It's great that people are aware that, the coffee can drive deforestation and that it's not just palm oil, soy, or other crops that are the big problem. So this is really reassuring to me that there's a lot of awareness in the coffee sector already about the relationship between coffee and forests.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that, I'm going to hand it over to our special guest today so that Bambi, if you can introduce yourself, and then I think you should have the power to share your screen.
Let's figure out how to do that real quick. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ellie and Kim and the whole SCA team for the invitation to present this morning and this afternoon for a lot of you on this series of webinars. I know this has been a great asset for the community during the COVID-19 crisis, and I know that you're providing tons of information and knowledge for the community. So thank you to the SCA team for that. So as Ellie said, my name is Bambi Semroc, and I work at Conservation International. I lead our coffee program, but I also work with our palm oil program, other agricultural programs to think about how we work with the sectors, and in particular the private sector, to drive conservation and economic development in the tropics, where Conservation International tends to work. So we are one of the largest nature conservation organizations in the world, with offices in about 20 to 25 countries around the tropics. And we started working in coffee over more than 20, 25 years ago, because we run into coffee in the places where we are working with people living in and around protected areas or important areas for conservation. So we'll get into a little bit more, but that should give you a little bit of the background in terms of why would a conservation organization work in coffee and really focus on the links between coffee and forests. And so Conservation International comes at this from the point of view that people do need nature to thrive. And so as we've been working on coffee for quite some time and working through the Sustainable Coffee Challenge and facilitating that initiative, we've kind of rejiggered that phrase and revised that phrase to say that, well, we know people need coffee to thrive, not just in terms of waking us up every morning, but also in terms of the people who produce the coffee, and it provides a lot of economic value into communities. But we also need to be reminded of that coffee does need people, and it needs nature in order to be sustained over the long term. And so we have to find ways of supporting all of that. So I think that Ellie already did a great job of teeing this up in terms of, does coffee drive deforestation, and do we really need to worry about this? I think that it sounds like I might be, speaking to some of the converted already who know that coffee can drive deforestation. But just to put this in a little bit of perspective, a lot of the scientific research will tell you that, well, when it comes to global tropical deforestation, coffee is not really one of the big four drivers of deforestation. It's palm oil, it's soy, it's beef, it's pulp and paper, and timber use that really create these kinds of what we would consider sometimes scars on the landscape that look like this, where there's a huge delineation between what's been cleared and where the natural forest remains for a bit of time before some sort of replanting goes in. But there's, this is what they're looking at from space when they're looking at deforestation, what is easily detected. But we know that, we've seen some things come out in the literature recently that suggests that, coffee is moving up in terms of scrutiny, in terms of land use, climate. And when you think about land use, we think about, how much land does coffee need? And then how much more land might coffee need into the future? And so this slide is from a recent report that actually Kim Elena flagged for me recently and said, well, why is coffee up there so high with like lamb and beef and cheese? And is it just like these are the things that the researchers chose to look at, or is there really something behind this? And so we feel like coffee is going to get more scrutiny in terms of its footprint, in terms of land use. And we have to be conscious of that in terms of what it means for forests. And we have been in meetings sometimes where people do tell me, well, do we really need to worry about this? Because I don't see it on the ground. I mean, we're doing the right things. We don't see coffee driving deforestation. I've been at Conservation International for over 18 years now and had the privilege of being in Indonesia and, Peru, Mexico, Brazil, a number of different countries. And I honestly have to say that in most places where I've been, I've seen some evidence of coffee-driven deforestation. And this is what it tends to look like in the places where we have field projects and where we work. It's not like what I showed you, where you see like that huge demarcation between what's been cleared and what's what's remaining forest. And in this picture, you see this from North Sumatra in Indonesia. You see this big stumps remaining. You see some trees remaining. You see some raggedy edges around the sides. And you see coffee going in, and that's what the little green bushes are that you see in amongst those big stumps. This is what it tends to look like, and it's this idea of thinking about it from the point of view of death by 1,000 cuts. And so a lot of times this is illegal deforestation. It's in protected areas, or it threatens the surrounding areas of high conservation value forests that may or may not be protected. And it's really hard to detect this sometimes unless you're on the ground with boots on the ground, or doing high level or fine scale surveillance from remote sensing or from space. And so we see this where we're working, and we also know that the pressure, the evidence is that the pressure is mounting on this. We did a study a few years ago with some researchers, and really looking at what's the future of coffee look like. And what we found there was that in order to meet the demand for coffee into the future, we would need to potentially double or even triple production by 2050. And what that means is we would need about 4 to 14 million more tons per year to meet future demand. And that demand could be coming from places like China and India as they transition potentially from tea to more coffee consumption. But it's also due to population rise throughout the world. In order to meet that demand, if we're growing coffee on about 10 million hectares worldwide, that could mean tripling that area if we're not able to increase production on existing coffee farms. And we're trying to do that at a time when climate change is really threatening the viability of coffee, especially in lower elevations where we're currently growing coffee. And so if climate change threatens about 50% of the world's coffee areas in terms of their suitability, and if Arabica coffee production needs to move up in altitude to produce those high quality beans, that means that we're often rubbing up against the last remaining intact forests. And so when we look at the suitability models that CIAT has published, we overlaid those with where forests currently are, and we found that 60% of the suitable area to grow coffee in 2050 is actually covered by forest. And it's interesting because that's actually the case today as well. And only about 20% of that forest that is suitable for coffee is under any sort of formal protection. This is really the issue that we see. And then the question becomes, well, is there enough non-forested suitable land to maintain coffee production volumes? And so we looked at this for a number of different countries, and the one that I wanted to share with you today was the case of El Salvador, where when we looked at this in around 2010, the light brown shaded boxes represents the amount of coffee production and area that is currently suitable for coffee. And if you break that down between what's forest and non-forest, the non-forest is in the dark brown and the forest suitable areas in the green. And what's going to happen, or what the models project in El Salvador, is this tremendous decline in suitable area because of changes in temperature and rainfall patterns. And so you just don't have enough non-forest suitable area to remain as productive as El Salvador is today. And so what does that mean? It means that you either have to tremendously improve the productivity on a per hectare basis on that non-forest area that remains suitable, or you have to increase the total area. And increasing that total area means going into forest areas. So these are the situations that we're seeing, not just in terms of what coffee could be doing to forests today, but what the trajectory really looks like. And some of the things that we tend to talk about is that people might not think of coffee as a current driver of deforestation, but we believe it's going to be a significant future driver of deforestation, especially for really high value, high conservation value forests. Last year, we were so fortunate to work with SCA, Coffee and Climate, IDH, and the Global Coffee Platform to really think about the role of climate change and how it is impacting the coffee sector and what we need to do to address this. And one of the areas that this study identified was this loss of suitable land. So this is coming up in more and more of the literature. You can see on the rest of the slide some of the other critical issues facing coffee. And these other things like water stress, poor flowering, cherry development, pest and disease outbreaks, and the vulnerability of smallholder production systems and women in particular, can really hurt our chances of actually being able to increase production on the existing coffee farms. So we have to be able to get ahead of this and really align the sector and get the resources flowing to really address this crisis that is brewing in the coffee sector. So that's kind of the bad side of things in terms of what we're facing in terms of threats. The good news is that coffee has a lot of potential in helping to tackle the impacts of climate change. And so, we want to think more about, well, how can we make coffee part of the solution? We have some new research that some of our Conservation International science colleagues just came out with a week and a half ago, together with the Nature Conservancy and a host of other organizations, really trying to identify where are the places on the planet that have what we call irrecoverable carbon. This is carbon-rich lands that really, if lost, could not be restored. We couldn't get the carbon back in the ground by mid-century in order to address anything that's lost. And so the dark purple areas are the areas that harbor the most carbon in the soils and in the above ground vegetation. And you see that overlaps quite significantly with where we're growing coffee. So this is just a reminder that where we're growing coffee is in really important sites for conservation as well as for communities. And so what we've done is we've looked at, as an organization, what does the planet need by 2030 in order to get on the right path for climate change. And what this means is that in order to not have an increase in our planetary warming of 2 degrees or keep it below 1.5 degrees by mid-century, we are going to need to make sure that we're doing all the right things to reduce the emissions that we're seeing go back into the air in terms of greenhouse gases. And so what we've looked at is the role that nature can play in that. And what we've calculated is that what we need nature to provide about 1/3 of the climate solution to keep us on track to not have above 1.5 to 2 degrees of global warming. And to do that, of course, we still need to be investing in fossil fuel and other emissions reduction management, but we also need to be protecting ecosystems and restoring ecosystems. And this is really relevant to today's situation with the COVID-19 crisis as well. I mean, some of our lead scientists are really talking about this. You may have seen some reports in the news about, the wildlife trade and how COVID-19 began was really about the links between wildlife markets and live meat markets, and that zoonotic transmission between animals to human populations. And so when we have a lot of forest, we have a lot of habitat for animals, we can isolate those more quickly, and we can really not have global pandemics. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is not just for the benefit of species and critically endangered species like tigers and orangutans and what have you, but it's also to protect ourselves from these types of global health issues, and to protect our communities from the rising sea levels, and making sure that we have coffee production systems into the future. So what we've been doing as the coffee program within Conservation International over the past, I would say, almost 6 months, is really looking at the role of coffee as a nature-based solution to climate change. And so how does coffee contribute to those 10 gigatons that we need to be getting out of nature? And so when we've looked at this, we've noted that the total carbon benefit from sustainable coffee could be upwards of 1.6 to 3.4 gigatons. And when we talk about nature-based climate solutions, it's really about trees on land when we think about it. It's about how do we conserve the trees that are there? How do we plant more trees? And do we do that on farm? Do we do that off farm? Where in the landscapes can we do that? So I mentioned already that coffee is currently grown on about 10 million hectares globally. If we needed a business as usual scenario to meet that future demand, that could mean an additional 10 to 20 million hectares that we would need if we can't meet that demand on current land. And if we were to lose 20 to 30 million hectares of tropical forests, that's between 1.6 and 3.3 gigatons of carbon emissions. But on the opportunity side, some of the science shows us that about 41% of the 10 million hectares of coffee has no shade cover. And we know that shade can be an important climate adaptation strategy for farmers. And so there's a tremendous opportunity for increasing shade and other tree plantings, not just, putting trees on top of coffee trees, but around coffee trees as well in terms of windbreaks and other tree plantings. And so if we were able to increase that tree cover on about 4.1 million hectares, we could store an additional 25 million to 148 million tons of carbon, depending on the type of system applied. So we can look at different coffee production systems and estimate how much carbon is actually locked in or stored within those. And what we need to make sure is we can sustain those systems. And we believe that by applying these types of solutions, we can help farmers withstand climate, market shocks, and help them diversify their income sources as well, especially if we can link farmers to carbon markets that would pay and incentivize farmers for not just producing the coffee, but also producing the carbon and storing the carbon on these lands. And so when we talk about climate sides of things, we tend to talk about these gigatons and megagrams, and just these weird, different units that people aren't as familiar with. And so there was a great article by the Washington Post, a local newspaper here where I live, that talked about, okay, what really is a gigaton? And the best thing that I could think about in terms of the best example they had from a conservation aspect is about 100 million African elephants would be 1 gigaton. So we're talking about tremendous weight in terms of what coffee can provide into the climate solution. And it's always good to get some wildlife pictures into all of our presentations. So then the question becomes, okay, well, how do we know what to do where? And so the other piece that we've been looking at is how do we align the sector around different priorities? And when we think about priorities, we can think about where there's high potential for coffee-driven deforestation today. And the countries that start to pop up here are Colombia, Indonesia, and Peru. And people are always surprised by Colombia because people feel like it's pretty stable in terms of coffee production. But the reason that some of these countries pop up is they still have a tremendous amount of hectares of primary forest that remain. And there's been growth in the coffee area harvested over the past 5 years. And there's a lot of forest that is suitable for coffee production either now or into the future. The next category that we've been looking at is how this plays out into the future in terms of the potential for coffee-driven deforestation, and whole additional set of countries pops up, but some of the ones that were in today's situation also pop up. And so these are countries where there is that situation that we have in El Salvador, where there's just not enough non-forest suitable area to maintain even current levels of production. We're also looking at where there's still that 10 million hectares of unprotected forest that is suitable, and we're continuing to see growth in the area harvested. The next one is where we see more on that positive side of where we see the potential for reforestation within coffee production systems. And these are areas where we tend to have low levels of shade production, high declines in suitable land for coffee, and significant potential for coffee-driven reforestation. And so these are countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Mexico. And then the next one is where we have high potential for avoided deforestation through coffee, through things like technical assistance and renovation, rehabilitation, and investment. So when we tear out old, diseased, dying coffee trees and replant, in a continuous way. And especially when we support smallholders in this, we can avoid the need to expand the footprint of coffee into forested areas. And so these are the countries like Indonesia, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Uganda, Peru, and Mexico all come up as having high levels of smallholder need and smallholder production. And the last one that I want to show you too is where we see potential significant tree cover loss due to lost coffee areas. So if we can't increase coffee production on existing lands, and the suitability in the future is quite at risk, and we're already seeing some decline in the area harvested, that means that we are not maintaining the carbon that we're storing in coffee areas. And when we think about, we're supposed to be talking about coffee and forest, but we can also think about agroforests, and coffee is an agroforestry system that stores a tremendous amount of carbon. And so we can't forget about these countries where, you know, that area of coffee is actually already in decline, and we see that decline could actually increase in the future. And if that were to move into a row crop like a corn or a soy or even just pasture, we lose all of that carbon that's currently stored in those coffee systems. And so there's tremendous need for coffee to remain in these landscapes. And so one of the things that we tend to think about is, you know, we hear a lot in the news about, oh, are we going to have coffee in the future due to climate change and the disruption that climate is predicted to have on the coffee sector. And what we think is that it's time for the coffee sector to lead in disrupting climate change for the reasons I just stated, in that we have to act urgency. So the time really is now to bring the sector together to do this. And again, we can do all the science in terms of where we should work and, you know, why this is important, but then we have to figure out, okay, what do we actually do to solve some of this? This is a picture of coffee in the ALTO MAYO San Martin region of Peru, where as Conservation International, we've been working here for quite some time to protect forests and to promote sustainable coffee. This is a protected forest. It's important for threatened and endangered species. You can see some of the numbers on the left-hand side. It's home to about 283,000 people, and it includes 14 watersheds within it. And what you see here is we think about this as the entire basin. So the dark green represents the actual protected forest. The light green is the actual subbasin, and we have a lot of indigenous native communities living in this area as well. So we have to think about their rights and responsibilities too. And what we found there is that coffee was a major driver of deforestation, responsible for about 40% of what we were losing in that actual protected area. And this is what it looks like. Again, very similar to the image I shared with you from Indonesia. A lot of stumps, smaller stumps in this case, not as old trees being cut down, but still really, you know, death by 1,000 cuts a bit. And what was happening here is it was a little bit of a slash and burn coffee system where coffee would be planted for and produced for about 7 years. They would not be maintaining it in any kind of sustainable way. And so after 7 years, the production would decline quite drastically, and they would abandon this land and clear a new section of forest and restart that process all over again. So we need to figure out a way to break that cycle. Unfortunately, this is what the traditional production curve looked like before we went in. So you see that significant drop off in year 6, 7, and you can see why farmers would just abandon it at that point. But by inputting and working with communities and working with individual farmers one by one, to form cooperatives, to get them inputs, to get them technical assistance, we were actually able to reverse that trajectory and not just stabilize production, but actually increase production on a per hectare basis over time. And the way that we do this is, it's not rocket science. It's what we've known is good for coffee farmers, good for nature, good for people for so long. It's really providing good technical assistance, good training, access to inputs, doing demonstration plots, making sure farmers have access to pest control, renovation, all those types of things. And we do this with in the format of also signing conservation agreements with, in this case, it was with individual farmers because they were not organized in any way, shape, or form. So we went in and helped organize the farmers. But before doing so, we wanted to have a conversation with farmers about what would it take to stop this cycle. And we now have conservation agreements signed with over thousands of farmers in this particular region, where they have agreed to stop the encroachment into the forest, and we have agreed to provide the technical assistance necessary and the farm support necessary to sustain coffee production and to maintain the ALTO protected forest. And we've been also able to monetize that that process in terms of the carbon credits coming out of this to finance the long-term provision of those services into the future. So this is one example. And so I want to have us think about, okay, where should the coffee sector go from here? We feel like the coffee sector needs to commit to a climate resilient sector that does support farmers, sustains coffee, and conserves forests. We've got to be better and more proactive at designing and implementing collective action programs that do these types of interventions or sustainable economic development at the community and landscape levels. This is not just by a farm approach. This is really looking at a landscape, what's driving change in those landscapes, what's the role of coffee, and getting the investment and the action plans in place so that we can actually change that trajectory. In some places might be designing, implementing programs that actually drive reforestation and restoration. So it's not always just the negative, but we're also trying to find where there's the best opportunity for coffee to drive improvement as well in terms of improving forest cover. We've got to also be better at monitoring changes in coffee, forest, and carbon over time. There's a lot of work that we've already started to do there in terms of just trying to detect where we see the opportunity and the risk in some countries, and we're starting off in Colombia and Indonesia. But those types of monitoring systems need to be implemented across all coffee producing countries so that we're just better able to identify where to put these types of programs in place. And so as Conservation International, we've been doing this one-on-one with a number of companies, government partners, public donors. And what we found was like we're not scaling up these programs quite fast enough. And so back in December of 2015, together with the support of Starbucks and the SCA, we launched the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. And this is an initiative that is convened and facilitated by Conservation International, but with tremendous support from so many different organizations like Fair Trade USA, Rainforest Alliance, the SCA, partnership with the NCA. So big coalition that grew from just 18 partners back in 2015 that signed on to this big ambitious agenda to make coffee the world's first sustainable agricultural product. And today we have more than 140 partners. Those represent governments, government agencies. They are every single type of entity that Ellie listed on that first poll in terms of roasters, retailers, grocery retailers, trading companies, farm organizations, all working towards this big ambitious goal. And I know that we've always had this big ambitious goal for quite some time, but it was really time to rally everybody around it. And so we know that we all have a role to play. And like I said, we welcome everybody to this particular agenda and table. We know that it's going to take all of us to really address some of the things that I've showed you in the previous sections of this webinar. But it's going to take the private sector, civil society and associations, and the public sector working together to really address these issues at the scale that we need to be addressing them. And if you're interested in learning more, you can always email us at sec@conservation.org. This is just a list of the partners that we currently have. I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly because it's about 145 logos right now up on the screen. But if you just take a glance at it, it does represent very small, privately held coffee businesses and coffee retailers, all the way through to big coffee companies, mainstream coffee companies that would not be SCA members, and tons of NGOs, all the certification organizations, really trying to get them aligned on the big picture. And so what we've been doing over the past 5 years is really trying to increase the transparency of who's doing what on sustainability across the coffee sector. We just released our first annual, what we call Commitments Hub report. So we ask people to go into our Commitments Hub and state their commitment to sustainability and report annually on their progress. And so we took stock of what was in that Commitments Hub, and now are releasing annual reports to showcase what coffee is doing in terms of driving sustainability. We also spent a lot of time, about almost 2 years' time, trying to figure out what does sustainability really look like and what does it mean for the coffee sector. And so we aligned the sector around a common sustainability framework that's now been adopted by the Global Coffee Platform as well as ourselves, working now with the ICO process to make sure that this is the basis for ongoing discussions. And then we also, as part of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, we have a number of 4 different what we call collective action networks. So the coffee community came together under the Sustainable Coffee Challenge to identify the different issues that they wanted to tackle collectively. And so we have created these collective action networks. And the one that's really relevant to the topic today is this mapping and monitoring of coffee and forest. So in the sustainability framework, and we have a whole section on how we conserve nature. And one of the areas where we felt like we needed to understand more about where we need to conserve nature and how we do it is just understanding where is that interplay between coffee and forest becoming really critical, and how do we understand that. And so we've created a wide range of tools and resources to guide partners in terms of just understanding sustainability, but then also have pocket guides and resources for how we think about coffee and forests as well. And so just last month, before the COVID crisis really hit, we snuck in our annual all partner meeting in Austin alongside of the National Coffee Association annual conference. And one of the things we did there was talked about what our long-term goals should be for the sector and what our 5-year goals should be. So this is an example of the long-term goals that we've drafted actually during that session and afterwards, in terms of what do we think we need to achieve by 2050 to be really on track of becoming the world's first sustainable agricultural product. And so those long-term goals include, we need to, of course, sustain supply, and that really comes down to how do we deal with smallholders and their productivity in the long term. We need to be improving the livelihoods of coffee farmers and really thinking about how do we ensure that they're achieving a living income, and that living income is also achieved by the workers who are working on coffee farms. We need to be strengthening market demand for sustainable coffee, and be transitioning the entire market to sustainable sourcing. So really trying to promote commitments around sustainable sourcing within the sector. And of course, on the conserve nature side, which is most relevant for this webinar, we need to be restoring about 2.5 million hectares of tree cover and conserving about 5 million hectares of forest to be on track for securing about 1.6 to 3.3 gigatons of carbon. So a tremendous amount of carbon potential if we can actually achieve these types of goals. And so what we have to do is you have to break that down into kind of 5-year plans to get us to 2050. And so we've drafted some 2025 targets that we talked about and presented at the all partner meeting, and these are in the works in terms of revision, and we really want to get more feedback on these in terms of how we break down that trajectory. And you see some X's in here under the improved livelihood side in terms of how many workers we can actually impact. But these are some of the placeholders. We feel like if we do this and if we really focus just on, to get to 100 million tons of carbon through nature-based climate solutions, we actually have to do all of these things. We have to be improving smallholder production on the existing farms. We have to be restoring about 1.5 million hectares of tree cover and conserving about 500,000 hectares of forest. We need, of course, the incentive, the markets to work on behalf of those types of targets. And we're not going to be successful if people do not have economic development and improved livelihoods and a living income from coffee. It's just, we can't conserve nature if people are impoverished. And so people always ask us, oh, how do you really get to 100 million tons? And so there's a science and there's an art to this in terms of we can get about 19 million metric tons via new trees on farms. and we can get about 75 million metric tons by just not encroaching into forest areas, really trying to increase and renovate smallholder farms in just a few countries, and doing that only to reach about 25% of the actual need in those countries. And so if we add those two numbers up, we get to about 94 million metric tons, and we think we can be a little bit more ambitious and round up. So that's really where those numbers come from. And then the big question is like, okay, so what do these commitments really look like? How would I put a commitment into the commitments hub that I just spoke of? We can do these things on farm in the landscape. We can do them in the supply chain. We can talk about, and the ones that are highlighted in green are the ones where they're really the forest related ones. We can do reforestation. We can avoid encroachment and deforestation. We can think about enhanced agroforestry systems. So where can we put additional trees on farms that, improve productivity, not just to reduce productivity, but where is that potential? And then on the downstream side, we need to make sure we're offsetting any unavoidable emissions that people are quantifying in their supply chains. We can do that through forest restoration, investments in conservation. So there are nature-based offset programs that could be invested in, like the one in Peru that I mentioned. So that program actually sells carbon credits that companies and other organizations can use to offset those unavoidable emissions. And so the last section of this is really just asking people to get involved and do what they can to help solve for these challenges that we see ahead of ourselves. They're tremendous challenges, but tremendous opportunities for the coffee sector to lead. And so we do welcome all actors from across the coffee sector to join us to learn more and align with these types of global targets that we're trying to set for the sector. So we invite you to set, share, and track individual commitments in the Commitments Hub to contribute to the collective action. If you're interested in the coffee and forest conversation moving forward, we are reconstituting that action network to not just look at monitoring, but to look at what we can actually do to solve for this problem and how we think about that also in terms of climate and climate mitigation. And then also we're asking partners to provide strategic and financial support to the challenge so that we can keep this agenda moving forward. Other ways to get involved is that we will be hosting a virtual coffee break on Earth Day, which is just next week, so April 22nd. And this is the first session in a series of calls and workshops that we're having to gather input on those 5-year targets and even longer term targets for the coffee sector. And so we'll have a very interactive session. We'll walk people further through some of the thinking I shared with you today and really encourage people to participate. And then, of course, we have a monthly newsletter where you can stay abreast of everything that we're doing. You can scan this, but we'll also have a link into the webinar. And finally, one thing that we're just doing to try and keep ourselves sane and our kids sane, if you have children, you know how hard it is to not have them in school every day. So we launched about a month ago, a art contest asking children to create a coffee-related drawing or a piece of art, take a picture and upload it to social media or send it to us. And then this Friday, we're going to pick our favorites and announce the winners and send out some prizes to them, where it just brightens our days to have these artworks come in and to show the support that children and the understanding that children have for coffee and how they interpret coffee in their daily lives. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ellie to see kind of questions that everybody has been probably chatting through that format, and I'll turn it back over to Ellie.
Thank you, Bambi, so much. This is incredible. We are getting a number of questions that have come through, so thank you for that. Okay. And as a means of transitioning into that, let's see what you, as our attendees, what is your experience in your involvement in the Sustainable Coffee Challenge? This is just information. This is not a scientific poll, but we're just kind of curious about people's awareness within the SCA community.
And Ellie, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, okay?
Okay. %75%, 78%, 81%, 84%. It's great. I'll probably give it about 10 more seconds. All right. Definitely a mix, including some Action Network participants, so thank you.
That's great.
All right, so let's take some of the questions. So first, this question is from Paulo. Paulo says, hi, incredible work in Peru. Excellent. Do we know how profitable this technical assistance package is for farmers? I mean, the curve of increasing productivity is great, but what does it cost for farmers to get to this curve, labor inputs compared to doing almost nothing on their coffee plot?
It's a great question. I don't have the figures in front of me, but we can track those down and follow up in terms of what it costs. But a lot of what we've had public funding support for is to help farmers get access and subsidize the access to the inputs that they would need to move in this direction. Of course, managing a farm is definitely more labor intensive than just letting it be and basically harvesting almost wild coffee. But I think, what we've been able to show is a long-term commitment to this place, and they have the carbon actually help us provide some assurance that there will be long-term financing beyond the life of what the initial investors provided into those communities. And then I would say that the bigger challenge that we've seen, not on the financing to get or just the convincing farmers to do this. It's been more like trying to find markets for this coffee, because who wants to buy coffee with a deforestation story behind it, right? If everybody has like certification that says we don't want deforestation in our coffee supply chain, we had to find outlets for this actual storytelling where we said like these people have gone in and supported changing the trajectory of what was happening. So one of the things that we struggle with sometimes is we know that companies don't want to buy coffee from these types of situations, but if we don't invest, these things are going to continue. And so we have to find ways to bring these farmers into mainstream supply chains, especially within the specialty industry. And so I think there's a great potential there. And so we always have, they've gone from like 1 container a year to 11 containers of specialty coffee that they're exporting into the US and European markets right now. And so really always looking for markets that are willing to accept that coffee and that story.
Thank you. We have another question from Alejandra. So Alejandra asks, what do you think about greenhouses? Could it be possible to reproduce exactly the humidity and weather to make it grow up? Is this the next step in the industry?
It's a great question. We have not looked into greenhouses simply because we are trying to maintain, like I said, the coffee footprint on the existing lands. If that land transitions out of coffee, we think it'll likely go into pasture. It'll likely go into corn and bean fields. It probably won't be another tree crop. We do see people experimenting with avocados, but that's really, farmers are experimenting with other tree crops. It's just a question of, will we move into another tree crop, or will that land get bought or sold to somebody that's not going to farm it? And so I think the greenhouse side, it's important to think about in terms of how do you sustain coffee supply, but the energy used in that is quite significant. And so I think that it's resource intensive. And I worry that if we invest heavily in greenhouses for coffee, what happens to these communities and smallholders that would be left behind. So I think there's that. That's also, it's not just a carbon and resource trade-off, but it's a human trade-off and a land trade-off that we're thinking about as well.
We have another question from Manon. I didn't see Guatemala mentioned anywhere, and yet it is a major coffee producer. Is there a reason for that?
Right, so when we did all that prioritization, this comes up a lot of like, why isn't Guatemala on this list of the countries that we highlighted, or why isn't Honduras or some others? It's really because of the thresholds we set when we did that. If we had set some of the forest thresholds lower, you would have seen Guatemala or Honduras even pop up in some of those. But we set them quite high for a certain reason, to show especially around the forest side. And so if we had lowered those thresholds to lower than like 1 million hectares or 10 million hectares, you would have seen some of the Central American countries pop up.
Thank you. I think that we're getting close to the top of the hour here, and I have another poll, and just with the remaining time, wanted to mention the Sustainable Coffee Challenge and really urge, again, like not mention, like just remind and urge the members of the SCA community to check that out. And also there's a guidebook for how to make a good claim. There's a lot of resources about that we have at the SCA as well. So definitely urge you to reach out to us. Oh man, we got more questions coming in. All right, let's see if I'm gonna try, I have one more poll, which is just, we're trying to, I think you might have noticed that we are offering these webinars at different times. So a lot of it is so that we as the SCA can try to offer at like times that work for our global audience and not necessarily just some of the world. So there's a couple of choices here, and I am limited to 5 choices. I think I just wanted to point out Asia, Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand are all kind of grouped together, and that's because of the time zone. Same with Middle East and Africa, just calling that out. So if you can just vote and let us know where you are based, and this is just for our own purposes as we continue to schedule these webinars and kind of making sure that we're reaching our global audience. This was about the same as last week at this this 3 a.m. Pacific time. All right, 79%. Right. So having it right in the middle of the day for Europe seems to be a benefit. All right, we still have a couple minutes, so let's see. We have a question from Noemi. We plant shade-grown coffee plants in the Philippines, but I get conflicting advice that we need to cut the branches of the trees to give 40% sunlight. How much sunlight is needed after under shade conditions?
It's a great question, and it's one that it depends on the location of the farm and you know, where it sits on the mountainside, how much shade you're getting from the mountainside, what types of shade trees you have. So I think that there's no like hard and fast rule in terms of, is it 40%, is it 30%, is it 20%? It's going to depend on the actual context of that particular farm. And so working with local agronomists is really what's you know, local expertise is what's needed to really figure out what's right. I know that different standards have different requirements in terms of shade, and we can look at those, but it's really about figuring out what's right for optimizing your own production. My son's making a guest appearance here.
Wonderful. We have a question from Martha. How do we sign up for the Earth Day webinars?
Great. So we will send Ellie a link to that. There was a link in the slide deck itself, but we'll also send a link out to the SCA team to distribute.
Great. And we have that also in, if you download the handouts on your dashboard and you open the one that says United by Sustainability Resources, there is a link to the webinar on there. It's towards the bottom on the grid, and that should work. But yeah, I think if you're watching this as a recording, you wouldn't be able to do that. So we'll just send that by tomorrow. That'll go out to everybody, and that's just mark your calendars for next Wednesday. So that's going to be a series, Bambi, ongoing.
It will be a series. So this is the first of the series that we're doing, just to kick it, you know, really to kick it off in terms of, we wanted to do some things at the SCA Portland events and the expo this year. And so we're now doing all of that virtually. And so we wanted to kick it off with this one. And then we'll be having a series of different ones that think through the different targets that we mentioned. So probably a series of 5, one on livelihoods, one on markets, one on so, sustaining supply, and one on nature and one on the climate target in particular.
Great. Well, we'll be happy to amplify that through the SCA community as well, because I think there's definitely a lot of interest. So with that, we do still have questions coming in, but unfortunately we're not gonna be able to get to everything. Thank you everybody who joined us today. Thank you Bambi and Niels from Conservation International. Thank you to the SCA team. And above all, thank you attendees for being with us today. And definitely look forward to seeing you on a future webinar, and wish you all the best in your coffee world. Thanks.
Thank you. Stay safe.